We often hear that the best way to prepare the next generation for a successful life is through a quality education. But what about another institution of civil society that actually might play a bigger role in upward mobility and human flourishing?
I know some people shy away from saying that marriage matters. And in the state of Utah, we see the effects of marriage and intact families. We're killing it in so many different areas because our kids have that stability.
On this episode, we profile the state of Utah's recently created Office of Families and show you why the best way to equip kids with the tools for a successful and happy life is to elevate the importance of strong, stable, and healthy families. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and our guest this week is Aimee Winder Newton. She's a senior advisor to Utah Governor Spencer Cox and also director of the Utah Office of Families. Aimee, thanks so much for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So we're here to talk about families in Utah and why it's so important to have these kinds of family policy conversations. And your role with the Office of Families is still relatively new because it's kind of newly created. So I want to ask you about what you do in that role, why Utah even needs an Office of Families, because to some outsiders it might be a little bit odd. We get really great marks in the data as far as our family structure and stability. But to frame that, I want to read a couple of quotes from Governor Cox in the 2022 State of the State when he announced the creation of this office to kind of help set the stage and then ask you to tell our listeners why the office exists, why it's important. So in the 2022 State of the State, Governor Cox said, quote, "I firmly believe that Utah's success in recent years can be directly attributed to our family-centric identity. And yes, that includes our nation-leading marriage and birth rates. In fact, that has always been part of what makes Utah unique, strong, and resilient." The governor went on to say, "We know that the family, the basic and fundamental unit of our society, continues to be the most effective and least expensive place to solve problems." Given that kind of high-level framing of the office, what would you say to folks who ask, what is it? What does it do? Why do we need something like this in Utah, of all places?
Well, first of all, we know that the data shows that when we have strong families, we have better outcomes for our kids. And when we have better outcomes for our kids, that translates into a lot of savings down the road in social services, in the criminal justice system, in other ways. And so having strong families in Utah is critical for our state. And I'm so grateful we have such a great governor who gets that. He understands that. And so as part of the Office of Families, I'm looking at proactive ways that we can strengthen families. We want to look at things upstream, figure out how can we be preventative of some of the ailments that we see and what we can do better. And so whether it's government getting out of the way or whether it's programs tailored more specifically to certain groups, we need to be looking at all of those things.
You mentioned the word upstream, and that's something that Governor Cox has used as well. And I think that's a good way to frame both the Office of Families and just this idea of why family policy matters. And I wanted to kind of see if you can help give a framework for our listeners, because to me, it's not just about things like, childcare and paid family leave. Those are important, and yes, should be part of the family policy discussions. But when we talk about this idea of upstream, it seems that for most of the effort that goes into public policy conversations, it's usually looking at existing problems and how do we help ameliorate these problems in some way. And the upstream idea, this is also true in mental health and some past work that I've done on mental health initiatives, that if you're only ever looking at sort of crisis response and crisis intervention, you've been very involved with the mental health issue as well in some other capacities. But if you're only looking at crisis intervention and you're not looking at, okay, how can we go upstream, you're going to miss a lot of opportunity to make a difference. Is that essentially what you're doing here with the Office of Families and what Utah is doing by saying, let's go earlier. Let's go to before there are various societal or policy problems popping up and let's look at how we can strengthen this fundamental unit. Is that a fair kind of way to frame it?
Yeah, I think it's a great way to frame it. I mean, I'm basically the governor's family policy advisor. And as we look at how can we best help support families and children, we want to be upstream. I think of the story, you've heard the story before of somebody at the top of a hill, and they keep wondering why they need to have the ambulances at the bottom because kids keep falling off this mountain. And finally, somebody realizes, oh, we just need to put a fence at the top, and then we won't have to pay for these expensive ambulances and have all these crises at the bottom of the mountain. And that's kind of what I look at when I'm doing my job. I look at where are those fences that we can put at the top to help stave off some of the emergencies that we would see otherwise.
So when you're looking at the policy debates we're having today, what have you been working on that try to put in kind of these guardrails you're saying? What are some of the priorities of the Office of Families to help be preventative, to help be upstream?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I started my job about a year ago, and 3 weeks in, I met with the governor, and I had a list of 22 policy ideas, and I said, here's some different ideas. Here's 4 that I think would be interesting to work on. You know, what do you want? And he added 4 more to my list, and so that's kind of what was the basis for the direction I started working on. So I'll tell you a few that we've been working on for the last year. The first one, we recognize that so much of how children progress in their life is based on what happens in those early years. And in early years, I'm talking everything from when they're in utero till they're, maybe 2 or 3 years old. And so when we look at what's happening in their lives, if they're dealing with trauma or other difficult situations, child abuse, neglect, those types of things, it drastically has an impact on their life later on. So one of the things that we advocated for during the legislative session was some funding to look at an expansion of the current home visiting program that the federal government provides funds for. MICV funds is what they're called. But what the programs that we have through those federal funds are expensive. And so we only serve about 600 families. But basically, this home visiting program is set up so that a new parent with a new baby has a professional who's coming to their home and able to help give them parenting tips, evaluate the home situation, see if there's things that they need to maybe guide them on, connect them to resources. I mean, it's really somebody who can be a mentor for that parent. But we only service 600 families. And so one of the things that I wanted to push forward is let's figure out how we can better triage families and really assess what their needs are and fit them into a home visiting program. Some may be less intense. Maybe it's an AmeriCorps volunteer who's trained that, can be there for them. Maybe it's a nurse, through a program like Nurse Family Partnership. So we would look at where are their needs and how do we best triage. So we got funding from the legislature for that. We've written the RFP. We're putting that out, and we'll be analyzing that here in the coming months. So really exciting way that we can look at helping when we have children that are as young as 0 to 3.
I want to pinpoint something to that because I think often so many of the policy solutions in the family policy space, from my perspective, tend to focus on sort of an intervention that is not inside the family unit. So for example, people say, well, we have various public policy challenges. Let's improve or increase access to licensed childcare in centers, or let's have various school-based educational programs. And not to say that there's not a place for those things, but it seems that if all we're ever doing in our family policy discussions is trying to work on other institutions that are sort of in the orbit of families without actually helping to strengthen families themselves, we're always going to be playing catch up. Is this something you see as one, and maybe among some other ideas, of how we're actually going to the family unit itself, saying, how can our society, our institutions support your family to flourish so we don't need an intervention in the schools or in public assistance or workforce services?
Exactly. I mean, we know parents are best equipped to raise their children. And of course, you've got those rare situations where a parent is not the best one for that child. But we know that the outcomes are better when kids have that strong family unit and they're able to thrive. So that's why this is an important program. Going along with that, another one of the things that we have been pushing is ensuring that Utah's trauma informed. And so that was another one of the priorities that I had with the governor. And we've now got a contract with somebody who's helping to make sure our state is trauma informed. And it goes right along with that of, how do we help people who have dealt with trauma? Pediatricians, school teachers, others who are interacting with those children, and what does that look like? So you touched on the childcare piece. That's another one of the things that we're looking at. And that one's a tricky one because of what you just said. We really believe, and the governor feels strongly, that families should be able to choose what they believe is best for their child, whether during the day it's a stay-at-home parent, whether it's a child care facility or a grandparent taking care of the child or whoever. We believe that parents need to be able to make that decision. One of the things that we've seen as we look at data is that we have a fair number of parents in Utah who would prefer to be a stay-at-home parent and take care of their children. And so when we're looking at policy with childcare, we have to evaluate, well, is it fair then if they're decreasing one income by staying at home, is it fair that we take more of their tax dollars to subsidize somebody else's childcare? And of course, we've got programs in place already to help those who are low income, who are struggling. We've got the CCDF funds that come from the Department of Workforce Services, which is a great way for those low income parents to get some help with childcare. So we've already got some of those in place, but that's been a big issue. So do you want me to go on to the third one?
Please, yeah.
So our third one that we're looking at right now is youth mental health. And you talk about, how important mental health was earlier. The governor is passionate about this, and he is looking at the data and recognizing social media is harming our children and is a huge negative impact on their mental health. So he's been talking for the last year about the dangers of social media. We were involved in the legislation related to social media and helping social media companies have some accountability. There's lawsuits that the state is now looking at. And then recently we started a campaign to help educate parents on the harms of social media. So that's a big one, because we know if we can help parents understand, hey, it's 13 is too young. Do not let your kids on social media when they're that young. We don't have to pay as much in mental health costs later on. So it goes along with this idea of being proactive and moving upstream.
I mean, it's quite a range of things that you're looking at. I want to go back to one that you mentioned just in our couple minutes before we go to a break, and talking about the childcare issue, because that actually ties in very well. We recently had Representative Susan Pulsifer on the show to talk through that same issue. And we talked about some of that same data that you're citing from the Gardner Policy Institute, looking at sort of when you actually just go and ask Utah parents, what do you need? What do you prefer with respect to caring for kids and balancing that with your work? The strong majorities, as you said, saying that, well, we want to prioritize parental caregiving. Most families where both parents are working say they're doing so because they need two incomes rather than because, well, we both really value our careers. And so it kind of goes back to that core of the debate, I think, around childcare, where there's sometimes a tendency to push kind of a one-size-fits-all. You especially see this at times in the realm of federal policy, especially some of the proposals from the Biden administration that are kind of, let's provide one big thing to help address this issue. And it sounds like what you're articulating, that what Utah is kind of doing is saying, well, let's be targeted. Let's understand there's a diversity of needs. Of course, there's still a place for childcare services. But there's also a lot of other sort of preferences and needs out there among parents as far as what they want their work life and caring for their kids to look like. And so would it be fair to say that the Utah approach on childcare as an aspect of family policy is essentially to say, we are going to go to the parents of Utah and say, we want to help you move closer to your ideal circumstance for what you think is best for your kids and a work situation that best supports that. Is that a fair summation of kind of what we're trying to accomplish?
Absolutely. And in fact, it's one reason why the governor's office supported Representative Pulsifer's child tax credit this last session, is because we recognize that if we can help all families who are in need, then they can decide, are they going to use that money to subsidize part of a lost income or to pay for childcare or whatever they may need. Kids are expensive. We get it.
Well, we need to take a quick break. When we come back, though, I want to ask you about the success sequence. I want to ask you about family structure and talk about some of the things happening in Utah and some of your perspective on maybe ways we need to be expanding the lens for how we talk about family policy and what's truly helpful for the next generation. So we'll get into that when we come back. You're listening to Defending Ideas.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. We're going to get back into our conversation with Aimee Winder Newton from the Utah Office of Families about what Utah is doing to support families, talk about some of the policy initiatives and efforts, and how we can discuss the issue in a better, broader way. But first, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find short clips from this episode as well as previous episodes that you can share on social media and use in your conversations with friends and family. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Google, Apple, Spotify, any of the major platforms wherever you like to get your podcasts. You can also watch on YouTube and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. That's defendingideas.org. Aimee, I want to ask you about success sequence because I know this is something also that your office has been working on. And just as a refresher for our listeners, the success sequence being this kind of sequenced order of steps that young people can take that involve finishing high school, working full-time, and if you're going to have kids, do that after you're married. Started with Brookings Institution, AEI has done work with it, so there's kind of a wide array of entities seeing the pattern and the data, that those steps correlate so strongly. I want to get your take on, I want to quote again from Governor Cox in his 2023 State of the State, where he's kind of reporting out on the Office of Families and giving an update to the legislature and to Utahns. And in that speech, he says, quote, "Getting upstream of our biggest social issues and costs inevitably starts with stronger families." He goes on to say, "There is no guesswork here. The data shows that married, family-connected Utahns earn more, produce more, save more, and contribute more than their counterparts. And young people who get at least a high school degree, get a job, marry, and have kids in that order are far less likely to experience poverty than those who don't." So again, the governor's kind of just quoting the success sequence to us. What's your take on the importance of that as an issue here in Utah, and even as being a national model for that matter? And what do you see as kind of the Office of Families' role on the success sequence?
Well, first of all, we want to ensure that we have successful families. And so that means that we want people to be financially stable. We want children to have the best type of environment to thrive. And that all boils down to the importance of marriage and that financial stability that comes from the success sequence. So Governor Cox is a huge fan of the success sequence, as you heard. He did quote that in his State of the State. And we know that it works. I mean, we've had, we even have people sometimes who are like, well, but for minorities, does it still work? Yes, you still have, and it's still in the mid-90s for any situation, whether you grew up in an intact family or not. You're still looking at mid-90s if you follow the success sequence. If you grew up in poverty, you still have the mid-90s of success in order to be in the middle class. And I think that's so important. It's important for our kids to understand that this is what it takes. Here's the formula. And so, we encourage, get a high school diploma, engage full-time in the workforce, get married before having children, and those things in order matter.
So I wonder why it seems like in some circles sometimes this feels like a new concept, and it isn't. I mean, it's been around for a long time. The earliest that I'm aware of, Brookings Institution, there was a book called Creating an Opportunity Society by Ron Haskins and Isabel Sawhill for Brookings, which is not a right of center organization. They're well respected, do amazing work, but maybe considered more on the center left. And they kind of initially brought this together and said, hey, this data is pretty compelling. And then, as we've mentioned, it's been picked up by others since then. But why do you think sometimes this idea of the success sequence feels new? Is it just because we haven't talked about it in that kind of formal of a way that, hey, there's a sequence, that these three things really matter?
Yeah, I mean, I worry that our kids grow up in a day and age where we think government's going to come in and fix things for you. You know, you can't afford healthcare. Oh, government's going to take care of this. You can't afford a home. Here you go. And we've got to get back to this self-sufficiency. Not only is it important from a tax standpoint, we can't afford to pay for everybody's needs, right? Everybody has to take care of themselves if they can. But there's also so much, it's so uplifting for people to be able to provide for themselves and their families. There's something about that that's so critical. And so we want to be able to help people. We want to help them out of poverty. We want to ensure that they can be successful. And then it translates to the next generation too. Then those kids, their children have stability because, you know, they're in a married, intact family. They have a good head start with that high school diploma and with a job and all of those things. And so it continues to go on generation after generation if we can help people get there. And that's why it's so important.
I think kind of the theme you're articulating there is this sense of, a traditional way to describe it would be personal responsibility, but maybe a way to describe it today would be personal empowerment or agency. We've done a lot of work with Ian Rowe from American Enterprise Institute, and the title of his book, Agency, that's all about this. How do we empower the next generation with this feeling of, I can do it, I can accomplish things. I'm not stuck in whatever situation I was born into or raised in or whatever situation I'm in now. There are things within my control that can have a tremendously positive impact on my life success and trajectory. To me, that feels like an empowering message.
I agree. I mean, it doesn't matter where you've been. It matters where you're going. And that's the message we want to get to our kids. And, you know, some people I think shy away a little bit because they think, well, we don't want to make people feel bad if they grew up in poverty or if their parents aren't married or whatever. And I think, what parent doesn't want their kids to know, here's the formula. Here's how you can have a better life than I did. What parent doesn't want their kids to have a better life than they did? So I just think, you know, and as we look at marriage, I know some people shy away from saying that marriage matters. And in the state of Utah, we see the effects of marriage and in intact families. We're killing it in so many different areas because our kids have that stability. And a good intact marriage helps those kids with stability, financial stability, emotional stability. There's so many things about that. And of course, there's circumstances sometimes where that's not going to happen. And maybe that's not the right thing for that particular mother or father. But overall, we see the data and it's good for our kids.
There are two things that have come out this year, one from us here at Sutherland Institute and another from another Brookings scholar, actually, who works as an economist at the University of Maryland. But the first is our paper this past summer called The Utah Family Miracle that kind of helps put some meat on the bones, some of the data around, again, what the governor talked about in his State of the State earlier this year, what you're articulating now, just the data showing that, you know, we can at least in part attribute a lot of the success of Utah in general, our economy, our happiness, our quality of life, to the strength and stability of our families. And there's a wealth of data showing how important that is on an individual level as well as on a societal level. And then the second is a new book that recently came out called The Two-Parent Privilege by Melissa Carney. She's the one who's a Brookings scholar at the University of Maryland. And seeing kind of the more and more data emerge, I guess, that is sort of making this point through data and analysis and reasonable fact-based articulation of the evidence. That it, to me at least, it seems like there's sort of I don't know if you call it a turning of the tide or at least a unique moment, not just in Utah, but in our nation, to be able to talk about the importance of family structure, of two-parent households. Does that resonate with the conversations you have here in Utah? Does it feel like there are some unique pieces of momentum around that concept right now?
Yeah, I agree. In fact, I love on Melissa Carney's book that we've got the center-left economist who's talking about this. Like, how cool is that we've got recognition of how important this is? You know, it's funny, we talk about the Utah Family Miracle. I personally don't love the term miracle because it's not
Should
like
have told
it
us that before we titled the paper. Just kidding.
Sorry. I get it. But like, it's not like this magically happened. Like we have been very, we all take this very seriously, I think, in Utah, those of us who have lived here, and recognize how important families are. And we're a very family-centric state. That's not by accident. That's on purpose. Like we understand that. And so these things have happened and it has provided good outcomes. And we've got to continue, but we need to teach the next generation. And that's exactly what the plan is with the success sequence.
So you mentioned kind of, as you're talking about family structure and how important that is for our state and our state's success. It's one of the other things, and this is one of the recommendations in our Family Miracle paper, but essentially we don't track family structure to the extent that maybe we should in the state. And I mean that in terms of data. There are reams of data that you can look at from various organizations, state-funded and also private, nonprofits, research organizations that look at all kinds of different outcomes for kids: educational attainment, economic success, health outcomes. And when you look at those, you can break up the data by gender, by race and ethnicity, by demographics in various ways. But often it doesn't include family structure, meaning did they come from a single-parent household versus a married couple household. So that's one of the things we're exploring is, can't we just at least start there? Is that a good place to start? Let's just track family structure in the data to help us elevate that as a key variable.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, can you imagine if educationally we also had family structure as one of the elements? We already know from seeing data that kids are twice as likely to graduate from college if they have an intact family. So there's some good data out there already, but how great for us to be able to measure that in our state so that we can make decisions. And it's interesting because I think some people think, well, if we're saying that they didn't do as well because they only had one parent or whatever, is that going to make people feel bad? Well, maybe, but how can we look ourselves in the mirror every day and think that we're fighting for families when we aren't recognizing what really helps children be the most successful? And it is intact families. And so at that point, then you can look at your policies and go, okay, are we disincentivizing marriage? What are we doing? What can we do to better help marriages? And for instance, we have the Utah Marriage Commission, who has great resources on their strongermarriage.org website where you can get relationship help. They've got great podcasts. I mean, there's so many great resources for people. We need more of that. If this is the key for our kids to be successful, is strong marriages, like there are things that we need to be talking about so that people recognize how important that is and we can give them the support they need.
I want to read an excerpt from an opinion piece in the Deseret News that was co-authored by a couple of our Sutherland folks, Derek Monson, our Chief Growth Officer, and Brad Wilcox at University of Virginia and Institute for Family Studies. Brad is also a visiting scholar for us here at Sutherland Institute, and David Bass. So these three gentlemen wrote this article called Tracking Two-Parent Privilege in Utah, essentially making this case that let's just incorporate it into the data. That's an important first step. And a key quote that I think backs up what you're saying, when they're talking about the impact of parental structure on graduation rates, on other educational attainment, it's also about overall upward mobility. So they reference Raj Chetty, who's someone who's done a tremendous amount of work in the upward mobility space. But they say in this article, quote, "One reason that Utah does so well in giving poor children in the state a shot at the American dream is that its communities have more two-parent families than other states in the nation." And so it's kind of this idea that, look, it's one of the most basic fundamental pieces of our civil society, this idea of a family and an intact family with two-parent households. So it just seems like it's, I guess, why is such a fundamental thing not talked about as much as it should be? And how can we convince others who maybe would be reluctant to for whatever reason or just haven't thought of it before? How can we help show others that, hey, tracking this data and talking about the impact of two-parent households on kids is actually really crucial to our policy conversations, because otherwise we're missing something really big?
Well, I totally agree with you. And I think as we see more and more leaders like Governor Cox who support tracking this data, I think that we will get there. We do, at the state, in our Department of Health and Human Services, we do track this on some things. And so we're looking now at what other things do we need to be tracking and how can we better integrate this? And it is a very important issue.
So as we begin to wrap up, Aimee, I want to ask, so as I mentioned, two of the things that we're really concerned about, and in a positive way, because we see opportunities there, is success sequence and family structure. And they're connected because the family structure piece is kind of that third pillar of the success sequence. The first question I want to ask you is, specifically when it comes to marriage and family structure, how can we articulate the importance of that, or in Melissa Carney's language, kind of restore the norm of a two-parent household? How can we do that in a way that doesn't ever inadvertently shame, maybe kids who come from a single-parent household? If they say, well, wait a minute, I have a single mom or I have a single dad, and they work hard and I love them. Is there something wrong with me? Is there something wrong with my family? How do we articulate that message that this is a good thing to strive for, but we're not shaming anyone who hasn't had that experience?
Well, I think that is the question, is how can we help people know what they can strive for and yet not feel bad if it doesn't work out that way. I mean, life happens. We all have our challenges. We all have struggles. Plenty of people, their dream was to be in a happy marriage and they're not, and it's not from their fault necessarily. So it's a tough one. It is tough. But at the end of the day, I still go back to, as a parent, I want my kids to have the best chance of success. And if somebody comes in and says, you know what, if you do this a little bit differently than what you grew up with, here's where you're going to be. And we can still strive for that, and we can still talk about it. And it doesn't take anything away from the people who have had to struggle and who haven't been able to have that kind of life or have had to deal with so many challenges. So I feel like we owe it to our kids still to at least strive for the ideal and be able to give them the resources and help that they need.
Well, as we wrap up, what's next on this front with success sequence, with promoting the importance of family structure, married couple households and their impact on outcomes for kids, and also supporting single parent households, supporting folks who have had a different experience? One of the things that I think is so worth reminding folks is in the creation of the Office of Families, Governor Cox, as well as a lot of the things that you have said in the past year or so, is we're here to help all Utah families. And that doesn't mean that we ignore, again, the data showing a correlation between married couple households and outcomes for kids, but we want everyone to be able to essentially improve their situation from wherever they are, while we're teaching our kids that here's maybe a guide map that can help you as you make decisions in adulthood. So what do you see as the important next steps with respect to the success sequence and sort of that important reminder of the impact of family structure?
Well, first of all, I would love to see more of an emphasis on the success sequence in the materials that we teach our kids in schools. That doesn't necessarily fall under my purview. That's our State Board of Education. But if we can look at the finance class that's a requirement for graduation, or the health class, and talk about these different things and make sure that our kids know what's happening, we'd love to have our schools as partners in helping to educate kids on the success sequence. The earlier, the better, so that they can stay on track for graduation, because that's so important. As far as measuring the data on intact families, we need to be talking to the State Board of Education. We need to be talking to state agencies. We need to talk to county health departments. I mean, it goes all the way through so that we're collecting that data, because it is very valuable. It's something that we need to be using to make policy decisions.
Well, Aimee, we want to thank you so much for your time, sharing your time and your expertise on this issue. It's amazing to see just the amount of things that have happened since the creation of this office, and seeing Utah, I think, kind of lead out in many ways, providing a model for the nation of, hey, even though we have good marks when it comes to our family structure and stability here, we don't want to kind of rest on our laurels. We recognize that we need to continue to help Utah families to be strong and make sure that the trend lines are going in the right direction. So I just want to thank you for your work with the Office of Families and, of course, your time joining us here.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be here today.
Well, we're going to take another quick break. We'll be right back with Defending Ideas.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, we want to leave you with a few talking points that you can use in some of your conversations about this issue. And there were a lot of really good takeaways from the discussion with Aimee about the Office of Families and about sort of Utah's focus on family issues in general. So if you are someone who cares about the next generation, which hopefully is all of us, and you want our state and nation to remain a place of opportunity and upward mobility, a place where people can lead flourishing lives, there are three key principles that I think are worth defending in that pursuit. Number one, the family is in many ways the most important, most fundamental institution of civil society because it has impacts on upward mobility as well as human flourishing for the next generation. The data and evidence is pretty overwhelming that strong families lead to better outcomes for kids. And that kind of family focus in our public conversations and our public dialogue is essentially moving upstream to get ahead of a lot of the policy or societal challenges that we might otherwise face as a state and nation. In addition, it's pretty clear in the data that what happens in the first few years of a child's life is very impactful to the rest of their life and adulthood. So this family-focused approach is really crucial for well-being for children long into adulthood. And also, if we only ever focus our efforts on institutions that are kind of in the orbit of families, things like public education, institutional childcare, workforce and public assistance programs, if we're really only focusing there and not focusing on how to support and strengthen families themselves, we could always be playing catch up with some of these societal and public policy challenges. The second thing to remember is that the importance of married two-parent households for kids' outcomes needs to be elevated in our public dialogue. There's some really unique momentum already happening with that, with some of the things that have been happening here in Utah and on the national level, with data and evidence coming out showing just how impactful married couple households are on child outcomes. A good starting point to help elevate that principle in our public dialogue is just to better track and report family structure as a key variable when you're talking about outcomes on a wide range of policy priorities. And number three, the success sequence, which again is education, work, and marriage before kids, is a vital message of empowerment for the next generation. And it's something we ought to share with young people because they're already starting to make some of these decisions that will impact their lives. And the success sequence is important not just from a policy standpoint, although it does lead to helping folks avoid poverty, lead to better financial stability, but also, again, leads to this idea of human flourishing. And we want to make sure that that is an idea that we can convey to the next generation so they feel better equipped to make decisions that can positively impact their own lives, their work, their education, and the families they might choose to form into adulthood. We hope that this episode has helped you feel better equipped to defend the ideas that we talked about today. Ideas focused on the importance of the family, family structure, and the success sequence as something worthy of discussing publicly and conveying to the next generation. If you liked what you heard today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find short clips from this episode as well as previous episodes that you can use in your conversation with friends and family, as well as on social media to help articulate some of the principles that we talk about on this show. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, any of the major platforms, essentially wherever you like to get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel if you prefer to watch full episodes or short clips. And lastly, if you want to support the work of Sutherland Institute, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thank you so much again for joining us on Defending Ideas. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.